Good afternoon. This is Joe Miskokomon, Chippewas Thames First Nation. First of all, I'd like to extend my seasonal greetings to each and every one of you out there getting ready for the holidays. I know it's a busy time for all, and I thought that we would just perhaps have an opportunity to sit down and bring you up to date with some of the work that we've been doing at the council and what your staff have been doing here at Chippewas Thames First Nation. You'll recall that back a number of months ago, when I first gave my election platform, one of the top things I talked about at that point in time was the protection of our treaties and honoring our rights-based agenda. And since that time, I've carried that forward through all of the work that we've been doing. It all comes back to our rights as Anishinaabe people with Deshkan Ziibiing and our territories that are much larger than the Chippewas Thames Reserve as we know it. Our territory extends for many millions of acres and extends nearly half of southwestern Ontario, with our other treaty partners from Kettle and Stony Point, Ogimaa First Nation, Walpole Island, and the Caldwell First Nation. And so we've been engaged with those communities in a number of issues that are very close to our rights base for all. And I know we all carry that focus as we go forward. So with that, then we want to project in not only our dealings with government, but also municipal officials, including industry within this territory, that we have an existing rights that we are prepared to defend and to talk about and engage, not in a hostile way, but in a way that they have to understand that they're within our homeland. This homeland extends much greater than this Chippewas Thames First Nation. And when we talk about reconciliation, we're talking about not only reconciliation in terms of historical patterns, like I think we can all point to and realize that there was an industrial, or there was a residential school here at Chippewas Thames First Nation at Mount Elgin, and it was called an industrial school. So they try to elude the name of residential by using the word industrial, but it was all the same thing. It was where children were taken away from their families, from many First Nations around southern Ontario and beyond, and were placed here at Chippewa. And so we're the host community. So one of the first things that I had to do when I came into office is to address that issue of having a host community residential school, in which I invited Oneida Nation of the Thames and the Munsee Delaware Nation to be part of that history in which they're so deeply rooted, and that we're all members, quite truthfully, of one another's community in one way or another. And I was able to assist them in getting collaborative money and funding from the federal government for their participation, in which they now have, and they are now undergoing their own kinds of discoveries and their own history, and realizing that their history was all intertwined at the residential school. So that makes us all a family, if you want to, and that we have a common history, not only within these three communities, but also within the surrounding community of southwestern Ontario. So one of the things to do was to regenerate that interest within that larger family, extended family, and try to put together a strategic way of approaching the issue on residential schools. We're working on it. We're not there yet. We're a long ways away from being there, but our staff have been diligently working in terms of trying to determine whether or not there are actually sites that we need to honor and cherish as part of our history and the terrible legacy that was left behind, that we're now left to clean up on, quite truthfully. And that's generational. And so it's going to take a long time. It's not something that happened overnight. It was here for almost 100 years, and it's not going to take 100 years to recover. But it does take time. And so we ask you to be patient with us as we go through this healing process that some may have experienced more closely than others. I think that leads then to an entire kind of discussion on how we began to do transformative government and looking at how, in fact, we can't do these things in isolation. Every one of them are interdependent upon other issues, and they all overlap. And so to try to look at, just supplying or delivering programs from a silo kind of effect doesn't do the rights-based agenda any good. It's simply administering our own poverty, in which the government gives us half of what we should have in order to exist, in order to develop. And that's why we find most First Nations across this country in poverty of one form or another. And so it's changing and rolling back that kind of history that has gone on for generations. This is not the first generations that has experienced it. It's gone on for multi-generations. And this is the kind of legacy that was left with us, and the kind of work that needs to be taken on head first. But remembering that it's always our right first. It's no one else's. And we can never give that away. We can never let our guard down. There's too much out there that is attempting to continuously undermine our rights base, maybe knowingly at some points, maybe unconsciously at others. But we have to be the defenders of our right, no one else. We cannot leave it to anyone else to do. And so with that message, I leave you that we will always be strong defenders of our treaties and of our Aboriginal rights. And we look for ways in which to reinterpret those rights into economic advancements for our community. In order to change, we need to do the very fundamentals of changing how, in fact, we administer our government. Our government cannot be delivered in silos. What I mean by that is programs that seem to stand alone and have no impact on anything else. But in fact, they do. You can't talk about a lack of housing without talking about a lack of infrastructure. You can't talk about a lack of infrastructure without talking about water. You can't talk about water without having a clean water source or adequate system to put it through. Everything is interdependent on one another. So nothing can be talked about in silos. You can't talk about poverty unless you talk about wealth. You can't talk about development unless you talk about how to build developments. You can't talk about wealth of a nation without talking about wealth of the individual. Everything is interdependent. So rather than looking at having portfolios that center around issues as commodities and how to deliver those kinds of commodities, what we wanted to do is talk about delivery of government services on a collaborative basis. So part of that would mean, if we're looking at education, you can't look solely at kindergartens. You can't look solely at elementary. You can't look solely at secondary or post-secondary or college. They're all combined into one. You have to look at it in terms of lifelong learning. And what I mean by that is that everything has to be focused in terms of the development of the individual. It's not the development of the institution, it's a development of individuals. And every individual has a different pattern or way of learning. There will be students that have absolutely no problem getting through the system whatsoever. They're going to be able to do that on their own with little guidance and little help. There are other students that are going to struggle, and there are going to be other students that won't be able to compete. Those are the ones that we have to not leave behind. We have to not only celebrate our successes, we have to pick those up that are not in the same position to compete and to be able to perform on a normal classroom basis. We're going to have to look at different ways for lifelong learning. Some of that's going to be more traditional. Some of that's going to be land-based. Some of that is going to be more cultural. Some of that would be more academic. What we leave behind are the trades. And so in this term, I'm focusing on not only developing the process of an education transformation system that's based on individual learning, but it's based on lifelong learning. It's based in a way that promotes and celebrates the individual, whatever way they are going to go in their life. And all too often, we leave the student behind that may not be academically inclined, but more hands-on, that wants to work, that needs to have a job and wants to find employment, but we don't cater to that. We cater to academics. That's wrong. We're leaving those students behind. And so in order to change that, I've engaged in a series of discussions, both with private industry, with the labor unions, with academics, and those that have institutions. So at this point, I can report to you that we have been able to collaborate with an Aboriginal institution that is owned and controlled by First Nations in Northern Ontario, and they're prepared to bring a campus to Chippewa. And our focal point is going to be on developing trades. Many of you may know how difficult it is to get a plumber or a carpenter or a tradesperson to be able to come in and just simply do repairs within your own home, and how difficult and how expensive that is. This market here in which we live within Southern Ontario has a trade deficits of thousands of people in every line of work. Surely there's room for us somewhere along that line. And so in order to do that, we begin collaborating now with Atla River School, the education, the principal, the other teachers, that there are going to be children that may not want to go on through high school. You may know that in recent months, the Ontario government has dropped the accreditation level for apprenticeship training from a grade 12 level now to a grade 10 level. We can educate up to a grade 8 level. Why not build a school that offers grade 9 and grade 10 that would look towards trades and the introduction of trade schools? We're going to build a trade school here. We're collaborating with government now at the provincial level and at the federal level. They've embraced that concept, and we are now in the process of building the institution that would be situated at Chippewa. We've collaborated with private industry that are currently now developing and at this point even designing the development of that school and what it would look like. We're currently looking at lands that are going to be needed in order to place that school. We've also collaborated with industry that are looking to build an industry here for housing development that'll address not only on-reserve housing, but I intend and I have had beginning discussions with the Mayor of London in order to build a urban reserve to address housing and industry within the City of London. We've got to be in the marketplace to compete. And we think that with the collaboration of not only London, but also the discussions with Strathroy, in order to build a trade school that would be Indigenous focused to bring students in. And we brought the Carpenters Union in. We're having discussions with Electricians Union to come in and other skilled trades to bring their skills forward. And so far, within the last few weeks, we've already sent 2 people to pre-apprentice training with the Carpenters Union. That's the kind of outreach we need to take. We don't have the market internally to support that. We need to depend on the outside market and the skilled trades to help us get there. And developing businesses, and hopefully people in time will develop their own business and have their own skilled trade business in which to work within. This is the outreach that we need to take. We can't live in isolation. We're not an island unto our own. We need to collaborate, we need to reach out, and we need those other resources and skills to be brought back to Chippewas so that we, in fact, we can develop skilled trades and skilled personnel within our own communities and surrounding First Nations with us. So we can't forget that if, in fact, a person needs a job, the employer will require that that person have skills. We intend to give you that. In order to develop a plan, what we need to have are results. How do we, in fact, judge ourselves against where we want to go and what we want to do? That's going to require a considerable amount of discussion and input from our community members. So what we've done is we've now have submitted proposals to do 3 fundamental documents that are going to be necessary in terms of the development and future growth of this community. One of the keystones of that is to have a comprehensive community plan. Where does the community want to go? We've done one. I've done one back 10 years ago. It's now we've met a lot of those goals. We've met a lot of those kind of expectations. But it's now time to look to say, what are we going to do for the next 10 to 20 years? Some of this growth is going to require a considerable amount of capital input. That's not going to come to us immediately. It's going to be over a period of time. And so I'll talk about those kind of things a little bit later. But at this point in time, we need to discuss conceptually what does the community want to look like over the next 5, 10 to 20 years. And the guiding principles of that will be to have community engagements, community input, participatory government by the people, and in order to structure what a comprehensive community plan would look like over a given period of time. Accompanying that will also be the requirement to have a capital management plan, an asset development. How, in fact, are we going to finance these kind of capital developments over the same period of time? I spoke to you earlier on my election campaign that it's going to cost tens of millions, if not upwards to $100 million, of just putting water, safe drinking water, into this community. That's one of the infrastructural requirements that are going to have. We cannot have housing development without safe drinking water. It's that clear and simple. Some of you may know and have heard that just recently the Liberal government has tabled Bill C-61 in terms of safe drinking waters for First Nations. We intend to become actively involved in those discussions because now we have passed one hurdle over the last 4 months, and that we have been able to do studies that have shown that we have adequate drinking water within this community. Unlike our sister community First Nations surrounding us, where they do not have adequate supplies of water, we have adequate water. And so the pressure has come to us to tap into the Huron water line. We reject that idea. Number one, we have sufficient water to be self-sustaining. Why would we want to become dependent on someone else? Why would we want to municipalize our jurisdiction with other municipal jurisdictions surrounding us and have them tell us what the rate would be for our water? We don't think that's right. That is not founded on a rights-based agenda. We have the right to our own water. We have our own water. Why not use it? And that's sustainable for a significant period of time. So well past 20 years is what our study shows. So the hydrology science, the water science behind it is there. We don't need anyone else. So why would we participate and have them dictate to us what our water rates would be? Having said that, it's going to require, though, an upgrade a considerable amount of upgrade in the pipe sizing that is going to go through the community. The sizes that are in the community at this point have outlived their usefulness. They are well over 20 years old, 25 years old, and they were undersized to begin with. And now we have piping and water that simply won't be able to be delivered. So no matter how much water you have, you can only push so much water through a straw. We need bigger straws in the ground. And this is what we need to do, is to build that kind of infrastructure in order to do that. Accompanying that needs to have a modern and up-to-date water pumping station and a filtration station. That is going to cost a considerable amount of money, and we're currently in the negotiations of doing that. So on one side, we reject the government's positioning that we should tap into existing municipal lines, when in fact, we don't think it's necessary, when we can be self-sustaining. We have the trained personnel. At this point, I've asked our training department to find 2 additional men and 2 additional women that we can send into the schools to get their proper training and accreditation so that we would have sufficient human resources to man and stand by and operate those systems. You can have the best system in the world, but if you don't have trained people, you suffer the same liability charges that anybody else would if, in fact, there was any injury to any one of our members. So we need trained personnel to do. So once again, the training school comes back into reality. Why do we need a training school? We need a training school to develop our own capacity internally. That includes the youth and what the direction of the youth and where they should go. So upon that, we've set up a new part of and a function of council. It's going to be directed towards the youth and youth development. I've asked 2 of our members of council to take the helm on that, Alanis Delary and Kingston Huff, in order to develop that and put appropriate staff. And we look towards designing, as part of that planning process, a youth strategy for the future generations to come, including youth training, both in the academics and in the trades, and equally important in leadership. One of our major issues is to modernize our governance structure and our governance and jurisdiction structure. For far too long, we've been dependent upon the Indian Act. And while we say, we want to break away from the Indian Act, very little effort has been done, quite truthfully, in the past. So this time we're putting a concerted effort on. The first major issue will be is to address an election law, an election code that would be for a renewed type of election. Once again, we're going to engage our community members on simple things like, how long should a term be? Should it be 4 years? Should it be 3 years? Could it be 2 years? I can tell you from experience, 2 years is hardly enough time to move forward on an agenda and have it actually implemented. You will have to know that government watches us very closely. When they're watching how much pressure we put on them for something like a water system, they know that as a chief, I have a 2-year life expectancy within this seat. Then I have to go back for a renewed mandate. They will talk to you for a year and a half, and then they'll stop talking to you to see whether or not you can actually get through the next election period. If you don't get through the next election period, maybe somebody else will come in. Maybe they won't be quite as harsh on them. Maybe we'll just sit back and watch. That's the reality of being on chief and council. You need to get it within a very defined time and a time frame. And it's difficult because you're dealing with 635 other First Nations in Canada that want the same thing you do. We're all competing for the same things, the quality of life of our members. And government watches that. So is it important to have a 3-year mandate? Is it important to have a 4-year mandate? I think those are the discussions that need to take place. Other things like having a land acquisition. Currently, we have no way of acquiring land. There's no rules around it. Just recently, we've gone out and purchased close to 500 acres of land. And we had to do it without guiding principles of how to do that. We got it done. We got the 500 acres. It's back in our inventory. But now, we don't have a land management code. How are we going to manage that? So the first question that was asked of me after I announced it in the community meeting, what are we going to use it for? We're going to use it for future generations. The idea is once we acquire it, we're never going to give it back up. We're going to have time to figure that out. And we're going to have future generations to help us figure that out. But right now, we need the governance structures on how to acquire land. What happens after you acquired land? It has to go into additions to reserve policy. In addition to reserve policy, to transfer it out of fee simple provincial land registry now into federal land registry takes anywhere from 25 to 30 years. Are we expected to pay tax on that for the next 25 years for something that was originally stolen from us? I don't think so. I'm not paying the thief that stole it. What I've already told the municipalities and the cities around us, we are no longer paying land tax. It's ours. One of our top priorities is the health and well-being of our community members. So far, we have a very dedicated staff and very dedicated individuals that deliver home and community care and other outreach programs. What we're looking at, though, is a different method of not only delivery, but also taking authority of that. As the example, there are discussions currently taking place, and we are actively involved in those discussions on health transformation. On council, we are fortunate to have two health practitioners. One is a nurse, Councillor Heather Nicholas, and the other one is CHR, Councillor Monica Henry, who I've asked to take the lead on the table with health transformation. And what that really means is how, in fact, we not just take health programs like we've been doing in the past, but we actually transform them into what is the best delivery mechanism for Chippewa and for the Chippewa members. I've also asked Dr. Samantha Beauchart, who's a community member, to help in that. So we have three highly qualified ladies that are taking that responsibility and will begin to engage the community on the best delivery mechanism we have. Already we've outgrown in our health system, in our community care programs, we've already outgrown the physical facility of that healthcare center. We need to plan what a new healthcare center will look like, what it will deliver, under what philosophy, and how do we include not only Western medicine, but traditional healthcare methods. One of the big things that I've heard over the past number of months is that we're in severe need of mental health care for individuals. We need a new way of looking at addictions and how, in fact, we have far too many people addicted to drugs or alcohol or both. We need to reverse that trend. That is a trend that is not only here within Chippewa, but it's a trend that's across many First Nations, far too many First Nations in this country, and across our cities and within provinces itself. It's an addiction problem that it's not only here, it's all over the country. But we must look at and ensure that our members are going to be as safe as we can possibly have them, not only from those addictions, but also for care that is going to be needed in that healing process. So with that, we have instructed our police services, who are, like everyone else, understaffed, to be more proactive and vigilant in the awareness of drugs within our community, we want to protect the innocent and we want to throw out the drug dealers. When we talk about economic prosperity, you can't talk about it in isolation without talking about the fundamentals of fiscal planning. One goes with another. As we know, the First Nations are probably not the best to be in business as employers. We're probably better off positioning in terms of creating a separate wing of economic development that's separate from council, so it doesn't have political interference. And we're in discussions not only with our finance and audit committee on how to make these things accountable and transparent to our community members, but also they have to be accountable back into the community on generating funding and on the expenditures of money as it will take place in the future. For that point, we have begun discussions with Deloitte Accounting, and they will be assisting us in developing both sides. One, the accountability structure and financial structure of an audit committee, not a finance committee, but an audit committee. And there's two very different functions there. A finance committee has oftentimes just been going over the daily routines of how finances are expended. An audit committee does quite a different function. It does things like financial planning, not only for the immediate, for the future, and how, in fact, monies that are generated in terms of our own source revenue actually become expended on other items that are underfunded. So we have a healthcare system that's underfunded, particularly with the seniors. What do we need? How do we develop those programs that are going to actually give those kind of assistances to our seniors or to our youth or to our addicted? How do we do that? So that's up to the audit committee to figure out. What do we have to have, though, is a way of how to generate those funds. For far too long, we've been dependent solely on financial contributions from the federal and provincial government. If we're going to create our own fiscal independence, we have to create our way of making that possible. So I can tell you just recently as the last council meeting, that council's endorsed an agreement that we are now becoming an equity share partner with Hydro One in a transmission line between Chatham and the Lakeshore. It's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars. We will have an equity share, and that equity share of 10% of the overall revenues plus debt will be for generations to come. We need to establish these long-term fiscal revenue generating sources. And one of the ways of doing that is through the transmission of hydro within the province of Ontario, particularly our treaty area. We've been left out of that in the past. We're no longer going to be left out. In addition to that, we will have 4 more opportunities for equity participation within transmission lines within southwestern Ontario. That will give generational funding that will be completely independent from government funding. So we need to have a plan. We need to have a plan on how, in fact, we're going to utilize that money in a strategic way. And does that require then having different mechanisms or different institutions even being developed? We've now begun some discussion around having a mortgage program internal to Chippewa. We know housing we know that housing is in desperate need. Yet, we have no way of funding that. How do we create our own mortgage housing program that if we're going to have funding done, why do we wait and wait for developments by the 5 big bank institutions where they're going to take the profits. Why not reinvest the profits within our own community? It's when you circulate money within your own community is when prosperity starts to arrive. As long as you're spending all of your money and sending it outside your community, it's a one-way stop. It comes here and goes back out. The ones that prosper are the ones that live out of the community. Why not create our own so that money circulates within the community rather than going? It's said that a dollar has to circulate 6 times within a community for a community to be prosperous. We've already done a leakage study. This will be up to audit and to Deloitte, the finance companies, to come in and give recommendations to how do we retain that money, not just have it come in and go back out. We just don't want to be a mailbox. We want to have that money circulate internally so that we can create prosperity for individuals. I don't believe that the band should be wealthy and the people should be poor. I think that there's room for all. And I think that we can make strategies that invite our people that are now currently living in urban centers to come home. Why not have that air of possibility? As we come along this last several months, we've had to engage with the federal government on 2 significant claims that have been outstanding for quite some time. One is called the 1834 Caradoc Surrender Claim. In that claim, there was close to 3,200 acres that were illegally taken from our community, and we've never received compensation for it. So there are a multitude of discussions that go around with that claim. But after having only several meetings with the federal negotiators, they have tabled an offer with us. As recently as 2 weeks ago, we countered that offer with counsel, and we gave them a counter offer back. We don't expect to hear the results of that counter offer within the next several weeks, probably into the new year before they get back to us. But we're moving closer to the settlement of that claim. The other claim is the railroad expropriation claim. That is currently being negotiated. We're at the very preliminary stages, so there's not a lot to report on outside of that. We're just going through the preliminary kinds of administrative things that need to get out of the way before we actually get down to hard negotiations. We'll report on more substantive things later on that. Within that, the 1834 claim, though, I mentioned earlier that we have reacquired close to 500 acres. So people will say, well, why spend all this money on land? Well, the simple answer to that is, at some point in time, when we conclude this claim, which I expect to be somewhat in the near future, when we conclude this claim, we will have the ability to reacquire land. So why not reacquire land now and then put it on the claim as an expenditure of the claim to get reimbursed the amount of money that we spend now? So the anticipation is, while we spend close to $10 million on land, we will put that within the claim, and the government of Canada will give us back $10 million to Chippewa. So it's an investment, and it's an investment that we're going to receive the money back in return from the claim. And I'd like to tell you also that the money that we spend on land during this period of time between now and settlement will all be placed back onto the cost of the claim. So, in effect, the government of Canada is buying the land back for us. On the issue of political advocacy, I've been actively involved in meeting with both federal and provincial ministers and members of parliament. I've actively met with the Ontario government, Minister of Indigenous Relations, and we have somewhat come to agreements on very preliminary things like prosperity tables that I have been sitting with the Chiefs of Ontario office on. More recently, we've met with the Conservative shadow cabinet of the federal side. Recently, I met with the local MP in Ottawa with some senior staff, and we've talked about what, in fact, the pending election and perhaps new government would be willing to look at in terms of economic prosperity and the needs of First Nations, particularly Chippewa. So it's important that we not stay home and just do paperwork here. It's important that we actually get out and meet with other chiefs, with other leaders, First Nation leaders, and with ministers. You will know that just recently there was a national election for the national chief. I supported Cindy in her campaign, and now she is the national chief. So in turn, she's asked me to become a part of some of the functions that the AFN will be putting on in the future. And I've agreed to help work on some of those issues. So it's important that we network. The idea of all of this is being able to network. As I said previously, I've already met with the City of London. We've come to some very real agreements. As a matter of fact, the Mayor of London has written a letter of support for Chippewa as we develop programs and move forward. That we've already made submissions with senior members of the federal government through Indigenous Services Canada. And that's where we're looking to have the idea of the comprehensive community plan, the capital management plan, and the strategic management plan all looked at, including the funding of Deloitte in order to coordinate and help us organize those activities within Chippewa. Government is looking towards First Nations to provide answers. They realize that they have failed for far too long. So it's no longer can we blame government. We must take the initiative to develop and create our own destiny. How we do that is through the development of networking, both federally, provincially, municipally, and also with First Nation leaders across this country. So we must stay active in that network and within those advancements on how, in fact, those things are going to impact on Chippewa. So it's a balancing act. How much time do I spend at home in order to help create the governance structure in which we need to have to deliver? On the other side of the coin is I need to be out and I need to keep these networks going and keep these advancements going. So on one hand, when you're pulled to stay at home, there's always a pull to go out and create those other kinds of opportunities. And so it's a very delicate balancing act. Not only that, but having also to encourage local industry to participate with the economy. We have other industries that have approached us from Toronto. We're actively involved in some negotiations over our own healthcare system and perhaps in the participation within a hospital that is being generated. So there are many, many different kinds of networks that need to be kept going all at the same time. And that's why we need a very responsive council in order to do that has the strategy and has the ability to visualize what, in fact, that future may lead to. So as I stated in the opening with my campaign, that one of the most important things that needs to be addressed is open dialogue and communication. I need to hear from you, as well as you need to hear from me. And with that, I committed myself to give these kind of broadcasts that will give updates. I have the council committed to continuous engagement within the community development and the action plan which we're putting forward. We will be meeting on a quarterly basis in an open mic situation, if you will, at the community center. And we will hopefully have other urban activities going on in order to address those concerns. I think it's important that the surrounding municipalities understand the deep commitment we have to not only our people, but to our rights, and to continue to put our rights forward on every opportunity that we have, in terms of how, in fact, our territory is still our territory, and we are going to do everything in our power to protect that territory, including the waters, including the land, including the environment. And so with that kind of discussion, I've opened a discussion with the Minister of Indian Affairs with regard to net zero carbon climate within Chippewa, and how, in fact, that would look on future developments that we would take forward. So Council's committed itself to a net zero by 2035, and how, in fact, we have to repurpose a number of our buildings and a number of our houses in order to meet that climate change reality. So I think it's important that we think not only of the better well-being of our community, but the better well-being of our environment, and how we have to be a steward of our own lands, and how, in fact, we take the role in being that steward and leading that discussion with our neighbors, our municipalities, and our other levels of government. So with that openness, I hope that you will contact me at any time, and that I'll make myself available. Probably not right away, but probably I'll get back to you within a few days at least. And with that, by closing, to say I hope you have a safe and happy holiday.